Hello and welcome back to 7th grade Bible. Got our second day of a lesson for you here, a little lecture. Going to jump right into what we talked about yesterday. We're on page 226 in your textbook, page 226. And yesterday we talked about the story of Isaiah and talked a little bit about Isaiah and how that God had called him to be his witness. If you remember, it was kind of crazy actually, the way that he talked to him. I remember he got to see the throne room of God. I got to go in and see the seraphims that were crying, holy, holy, holy. I got to hear the Lord say, hey, whom will I send? And who will go for me? And he said, here am I, send me, Lord. And Isaiah got to be used by God. And God comes to him and says, hey, you're gonna give a message, but they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to care. And in fact, they're going to not want to listen at all. As far as don't talk anymore, we don't want to hear it. That's kind of sad to hear, isn't it? And Jeremiah, we'll get to Jeremiah. He was even worse. In fact, he was called the weeping prophet because the judgment happened during his time, and we'll get to that when we get there. But we finished up talking about Isaiah there, that 7.1, and just talking about how that God was going to give the people hope. There was hope, at least what God was going to give them, and if they repented. And if they turned from their wickedness. And of course, they weren't going to at first, and God chose to say, hey, well, because you chose to do that, I'm going to have to choose to punish you, choose to disperse you, is what the Bible talks about. But he did not leave them without a remnant. Remember, the Bible talks about he would cut them down almost like a stump, and there would be a stump that would remain, and there would be a people that would remain in Israel. But real quick, jumping into Hosea, we'll talk about him real quick and then get into the second lesson, 7.2. But Hosea was another prophet, and Hosea lived during the prophets, or during the kings Uzziah and Jeroboam. And God had a very specific plan for him. He was commanded by God to marry a woman by the name of Homer. I'm sorry, not Homer, Gomer. Hosea and Gomer. And Gomer had an interesting lifestyle. In fact, she was a harlot. That's what the Bible tells us. And she was well known as a harlot, and everybody knew that. And here's this prophet, and God says, I want you to go and marry this woman. Pretty crazy to think about, right? The fact that God wanted his preacher to go marry a harlot. And Hosea says, well, if that's what you want me to do, Lord, then that's what I'll do. So he does. Goes and marries her. And she turns her life around. She actually doesn't. She goes out and she begins to cheat on Hosea. She starts to be unfaithful in their marriage. And she begins going around and doing those things to Hosea. And everybody looks at that and says, what is going on? And God says, this is a picture of you, Israel. And God told Hosea that he needed to call out the sons of Israel and say, listen, this is just a picture of what you guys are doing. In fact, you can see on page 226 or Hosea 4:1, it says there that these guys, or these Israelites here, they were unfaithful and they lacked that hesed. Remember that hesed, that loving kindness or faithful love we talked about? They lacked that. And he says there, but what's worse is there is no knowledge of God in the land. The problem was that the children of Israel before this generation had not done the job they should have of teaching their children about God, and specifically about how they should act with God or around God or for God or whatever you want to say. Hosea talks about there they were guilty of swearing and lying, murdering, stealing, adultery. Right? They were violent. They were quick to shed other people's blood. One guy kills another guy, and then there's a retaliation where, in revenge, there's more people killed, and then more people killed. And Hosea comes to him and says, "Look, the thing is, because of what you guys are doing, says my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." God's judgment is going to come on them because they have forgotten God and they have not they have not seeked after him. There's another word for that. Wow. They have not. Whatever. And so Hosea comes to him, and Hosea tells them, he said, listen, you guys need to have some spiritual healing. You guys need to come back to God. There's only one way you can do it, though. And you can see on page 226, important note here, right-hand column, top of the third column there, it says, the people need spiritual healing, and the answer is to turn from idolatry and seek righteousness. That's Hosea telling these people. He says, look, you guys got to turn from your idolatry, seek righteousness. Hosea tells the people. And he says, look, you guys have been destroyed for lack of knowledge, and God says it's time to seek the Lord till he come and rain righteousness upon you. And God says, listen, because you guys are not following me, I'm going to disperse you. Just pretty much what Isaiah was saying. But interesting look there by Hosea, that marrying Gomer, and then he gave the prophecy there of they need to turn from idolatry and seek righteousness. But we're going to jump on into 7.2. All right, 7.2. This is page 227 in your textbooks. And this just continues on with Isaiah. So Isaiah first, right, in the first lesson we talked about, he comes to him and says, look, there's a problem, puts him on trial, if you will, and calls witnesses to the stand. And basically tells the people, hey, you guys are wrong, you have done what's wrong, and it needs to be fixed. And so now he's going to come in and he's going to, remember he talked about that hope as well, the hope that these people could be saved again. Well, he's going to come in, he's going to tell them about this person that's going to come in and save them. And he keeps mentioning to them and he keeps calling him the servant. That was the name for him. And it talks about there at the beginning, another person talks about a double standard of justice or righteousness or whatever. But what God goes into, or what Isaiah goes into, is describing this servant. Who the servant is, what the servant's going to do, what the process is like, if you will. And he is going to list dozens of prophecies. And of course, we know who the servant is. That servant there is capital S, and you guys can already figure that out. It's Jesus, is what Isaiah is talking about, or who Isaiah is talking about. And if you didn't know that, you want to note there, or it's interesting to note that Isaiah, he had the most prophecy of Jesus in the Old Testament. He had all kinds of prophecies about him. And you can see it starts in that page 227, left-hand column there, about midway down. It talks about the servant is a man who be called from his mother's womb to be a prophet. Behold, whom I uphold. In other words, God says, he is mine. There's no power that can overcome him. It goes through, God delights in him. God will put his spirit upon them. He will be a humble and non-aggressive servant. He will establish justice on the earth. He will empower, God will empower and have a righteous rule. And God has a lot of things, and we'll get to some more things in a second. But one of the also big things that God tells about this servant is that this servant will suffer. And the suffering that he's referring to is a term called vicarious. And you see it on the top right, page 227. It's a vicarious suffering. And the word vicarious refers to death on behalf of sinners, or vicarious refers to taking someone else's place. That's what vicarious means. Takes the place of those who deserve to die. And this servant that was going to live, that was going to walk the earth, was going to do all these special things, is also going to have to sacrifice. And this is going to be a vicarious sacrifice, or a vicarious suffering. He's not going to suffer because of what he has done. He's going to suffer for what others have done. And of course, we know that if you remember the study of the cross or whatever, that Christ went through a whole lot. And in fact, actually, we're going to talk about in a second, Isaiah describes some of those punishments that he goes through, all for the sake of us. The amazing thing is that Christ chose to do what he did. Now, he asked God if it's not his will, right? But he still willingly chose to live a perfect sinless life. He still willingly chose to enter his ministry. And he chose to die. And he died not because of his own sin, not because of his own problems, not because of his own wickedness. He died for me. He died for you and our sin. The fact that we needed a Savior. We needed someone that could do for us what we could not do for ourselves. And Christ became that vicarious suffering, or had that vicarious suffering for us. He chose to do that so that we did not have to. And really, even if we try to do that, You guys realize that even if we went through the same thing Christ did, if we went through every beating, if we went through every mockery, if we went through every scourge, if we went through every single second that Christ had endured, you guys realize that that would not be enough? God still would not accept us into his kingdom. Even if we went through the exact same thing that Jesus did. You know why? Because Christ was perfect. And God required a perfect, sinless, spotless lamb to take away the sins of the world. And it's through his blood that we have salvation. And the awesome thing about that thought is that it is, you know what? It doesn't matter what we do. We can't earn salvation. And it's a good thing, isn't it? Because if we could earn salvation by doing good works, you guys know that would mean that we could lose salvation because of bad works. And I don't know about you, but if it was a good works versus bad works kind of thing, I would not have a salvation very often. And I'm sure you guys could say the same. But the idea was that Christ was going to die for us. It's vicarious. He was going to suffer in our place so that we don't have to suffer. It's an amazing, awesome thing. But he goes through there in Isaiah 53. That's where a lot of this prophecy is found. He talks about there, people will not believe the servant, right? People didn't believe Jesus. People despise him. They'll be cruel to him. But no matter what, it says there in 53 verse 7, he will never open his mouth to protest what they do. Right? And the Bible talks about that. In the crucifixion story, the Bible talks about how that Jesus never once told them to stop, never once, called out for them to not do that. It says he will be condemned like a criminal. They would treat him like a wicked man, even though he was innocent. He will give up his life voluntarily. Another big one, his death will please God. The fact that he will die as that perfect spotless lamb. He'll be buried with the rich, right? Joseph of Arimathea was a very wealthy man. It was very wealthy back then to have a tomb all to yourself, and he was. And that's what he gave there, buried with the rich. But, in this awesome here, Isaiah 53 verse 10, but he will live again, for he shall prolong his days. Right? And we know that even after Christ died, he didn't just stay in the grave. Because if he would have stayed in the grave, it wouldn't have mattered what Christ had done in his life. It would have proved that he did not have the power of death. But he had the power over death because he rose again the third day. He walked around this earth for 40 days talking to his servants, talking to his disciples. He prolonged his days, just as Isaiah said. And you see there, his sacrificial death will justify many. Sacrificial. That term sacrificial there describes something of value offered to God. Each one of us have a different level of sacrifice, if you will. If I was a millionaire, all right, and I was a millionaire, let's say Nikolai. So Nikolai's a millionaire, I'm a millionaire. And then in walks Josie, all right? So I'm a millionaire, Nikolai's a millionaire, and it's time for offering, all right? And me and him, we go, and Josie, by the way, she makes $1,000 a year. We make $1 million a year, me and Nick. So I walk in and I give $10,000 to the missions. Nikolai walks in and he does me one better. He gives $100,000 to the missions. Wow, right? Look at the money, it's $110,000. And then Josie comes in and she gives $500 to missions. And we look at that and be like, wow, what a small amount, right? Josie gave so few dollars compared to $10,000, compared to $100,000. But the point is, and the Bible tells about that story, right? The widow's mite. Where the Pharisees, when Jesus was alive, the Pharisees were giving thousands and thousands of dollars out of their abundance. And this poor young little widow here walks in and she gives a couple pennies. And the Pharisees look at that and say, is that all? Is that it? She gives a couple pennies, that's it. But Christ says, guys, listen here. You guys gave out of your abundance. He says she gave sacrificially out of what she did not have. Same thing with what Josie would have done. If you look at that math-wise, she gave 50% of what she made a year. Josie would be sacrificing. And the thing about sacrifice is each one of us have different levels of sacrifice. And I can flip that on your head. Each one of us has different levels of talents and abilities that we have been given by God. Some of us are athletically talented. Some of us are academically talented. Some of us are gifted in other areas of our lives. And do you know that if you are talented better than someone else, you have been commanded by God to give more from that than somebody else? Right, the Bible talks about to whom much is given, much is required. So for us to look at somebody else and say, what a small amount they gave, wow. You got to think about how much they had to give in the first place. You guys, if that makes sense to you there, but sacrificial describes something of value offered to God. And Christ gave something very valuable, did he not? He gave his own life so that we could have it again. Christ gave up his life so that we could gain it someday. And it goes through there, and this is just Isaiah talking about the servant. And I think that's just about it for here. You flip over to page 228. A couple of things, 228 and then 229. First off, 228, they're talking about God's punishment. They were going to be carried away, were the Israelites. And the man that was going to be responsible for letting them go back to Jerusalem was going to be a guy by the name of Cyrus, King Cyrus. The king was going to be the man that allowed the Israelites to go back to Israel. Go back to Israel. So one other thing, and I'm trying to wrap it up here, trying to keep it about 15 minutes for you guys, 20 minutes for you guys, trying not to keep it too long. And so page 229 there talks about righteous living. Okay, it says there, talks about that the servant, one of the things that the servant would do would be that it restores Israel, Judah, and all nations to a right relationship with God. But until that happened, the Israelites had to live a righteous life. They had to live a good life. They had to do what was right, be genuine in their worship of God. They had to turn away from their wicked idols, turn back to following the one true God. But for today, well, I guess for these people, they had thought about, well, I was born Israelite, therefore, I automatically have righteousness. Or I was born an Israelite, so automatically I can do whatever I want to do, or whatever the thought was. They didn't realize that, hey, guess what? Just because your parents were Israelites doesn't mean that, and you're an Israelite, doesn't mean that you automatically gain the benefits of that. There was a covenant that must take place. You've got to do something for God, and God does something for you. Now, God still blesses us regardless of what we do, right? His mercies are new every morning. But if you want to have that right relationship, you've got to do your part as well. And it's no different from us. Right? A large majority of you that sit in this classroom, right, or sitting at home now, are from a Christian background, Christian family. Not all of you, but most of you are. And you know that just because your parents are Christians, you're not automatically Christians. Just because your parents go to church, and just because they take you to church, that doesn't automatically guarantee that you are on your way to heaven when you die one day. For them, that's what it said there. It talks about when you're born, you're not born a Christian. Even if you go to church every Sunday, even if you work in a ministry, even if you're born into a Christian home, even if you have done all the right steps on the outside, that doesn't make you a Christian. It doesn't bring salvation. And if you're trusting on your parents to get you to heaven, you ever heard the phrase that God has no grandchildren? You ever heard that before? God has no grandchildren. What that means is there's no such thing as your parents being saved and then you being saved. Therefore, if God is the heavenly father of your parents, that would make you his grandson or granddaughter. God has no grandchildren. Each individual person must make the choice for salvation. And you can't put it in the things you do. You can't put it in the places you go. Just because you go to South Haven doesn't mean you're going to heaven. Just because you go to a church doesn't mean you're going to heaven. Just because you pray doesn't mean you're going to heaven. Nothing like that. In fact, none of those things can take you to heaven except for salvation in Christ. And that's why Isaiah prefaced it with that servant. He talked about what the servant would do. He talked about what it would bring to the people. He talked about what it would mean for an unsaved world. And for us, we must do our part so that when Christ came, and that's what we're talking about, this is Isaiah talking. So when Christ came, he could fulfill the rest of the way. For us, we must do our part with what God has commanded us to do, and he will take care of the rest. Because that's the thing you see on page 229, last paragraph, and I'm done. It says, Isaiah also told his audience to live righteously while they waited to be delivered from their captivity. And what he wanted them to know is that they could not do it in their own strength. They would need God's help to do it. They couldn't do it by themselves. And we can't do it by ourselves. We must ask God for help to get us along the way. Well, that's about it. We'll pick up with this on tomorrow.